The galactic sovereignty had existed for 11,000 years. That was not a boast. It was simply a fact, carved into the memory cores of every ship, every station, every diplomatic record that floated through the cold dark between stars. 11,000 years of expansion, of negotiation, of war, and of peace. 11,000 years of watching younger species stumble out of their home systems, blinking against the light of the galaxy, and learning their place. The Kethra were the oldest members of the sovereignty. They were tall, with 4 arms and skin the color of deep ocean water, and they had been the ones to write the rules by which new species were welcomed, or not welcomed, into the greater community of the stars. The rules were simple. A species had to achieve faster-than-light travel on their own. They had to make first contact without destroying the contact ship, and they had to pass the evaluation. The evaluation was not a test of strength. It was a test of character. The sovereignty would observe a species for 1 full cycle, roughly 40 years by most planetary standards, before deciding whether to reveal themselves. During that time, sensors would track wars, treaties, technology growth, and the way a species treated those weaker than itself. Most species passed, eventually. Some did not. Humanity had been under observation for 38 years when the first anomaly appeared. Fleet Commander Yaraseth was aboard the observation cruiser Quiet Eye when the report came in. She was reviewing the latest data from the human world. They called it Earth, a plain and honest name, and had been marking entries in her log with mild interest. The humans were loud. They were messy. They argued constantly, even with themselves, even within their own political groups. They built things and tore them down. They wrote songs about sadness and then danced to them. They were, in Yaraseth's professional opinion, one of the most confusing species she had ever evaluated. But they were not boring. The anomaly report came from a deep-range sensor array, positioned at the edge of the human system. One of the junior analysts, a young Drell named Tix, placed it on her desk with both of his secondary hands, which meant he considered it urgent. Tix only used his secondary hands when he was nervous. "Commander," he said, "we are picking up a fold space signature inside the human system. It is large. It is not one of ours." Yaraseth put down her log and looked at the data. The fold space signature was indeed large, very large. She had seen fold space signatures from most of the major species in the sovereignty, and a few from outside it. This one matched nothing in her database. "Run it against the full archive," she said. "I did," Tix said. "Nothing matches. The mass displacement reading alone is, Commander, it is larger than anything we have on record." That made her stand up. She walked to the main display at the center of the observation deck and pulled up the sensor feed. The signature was not moving yet. It was simply there, hanging in space between the human world and its moon, pulsing with a kind of slow, deliberate energy that made the sensors stutter. Whatever had come through that fold, it had come through slowly, carefully, like something very large moving very carefully so as not to break things. "How did we miss the fold event?" she asked. "The fold was small," Tix said, "smaller than the object. We believe it compressed itself somehow, to fit through a fold much smaller than its actual volume. We have never seen that before." Yaraseth studied the data for a long moment. Then she opened a channel to the sovereignty's nearest relay point. "This is Commander Yaraseth of the Quiet Eye. I am reporting an unknown contact inside the human system. Unknown species, unknown vessel class, mass displacement exceeding all records on file. I am requesting immediate guidance and backup. Please advise." She closed the channel and turned to look at the feed again. Down on the planet below, the humans had not yet noticed. Their sensors were good, much better than the sovereignty had expected for a species their age, but they were still learning the feel of space. The unknown vessel was sitting very still, at a distance that placed it just beyond where the humans typically focused their telescope arrays. It was waiting. Yaraseth did not like that. Patient things in space were often dangerous things. The message from the unknown vessel came 6 hours later. It did not come on any sovereignty frequency. It came on a tight beam transmission aimed directly at Earth, in a signal format that Yaraseth's systems flagged as primitive, not primitive as an insult, but primitive in the sense that it was designed to be read by a species that had only recently developed radio. It was a greeting signal, an old one, the kind that the sovereignty had used 12,000 years ago, when they themselves were first reaching out to the stars. Whoever had sent it knew exactly how to talk to a young species. "They are making contact with the humans," Tix said, his voice very quiet. "Yes," Yaraseth said. "Should we intervene?" She thought about that. The rules of the sovereignty were clear. Observation only. No interference, but those rules had been written assuming that any contact with a young species would come from the sovereignty itself, or from a known member. They had never accounted for an outside party making contact first. "Not yet," she said. "We watch." On Earth, the signal was received by 3 different space agencies within minutes of each other. The humans argued briefly about who should respond, and then, in a move that Yaraseth found genuinely surprising, they stopped arguing and formed a joint response team in under 48 hours. She marked that in her log. Rapid cooperation under external pressure. That was a good sign. The response team spent 4 days analyzing the signal before they replied. Their reply was careful. It was translated into the same format as the incoming message. It said, in essence, "We hear you. We are here. Who are you?" The answer came back within minutes. The sovereignty's translation systems took 3 hours to fully decode it, because the language was unlike anything in their database. But the meaning was clear enough. The unknown vessel identified itself as a representative of something called the Vreth Dominion. It said that the Vreth Dominion had been watching this system for a long time. It said that humanity was an interesting species. It said that it wished to meet. It also said, in very plain terms, that it was not asking. That last part was translated 3 times by 3 different systems, just to be sure. Each time, the answer was the same. The Vreth Dominion was not requesting a meeting, it was announcing one. It told the humans to send a representative vessel to a set of coordinates located between Earth and the Moon, within 72 hours. If no vessel appeared, the Vreth Dominion would consider humanity's silence a refusal, and a refusal had consequences. Yaraseth stared at that translation for a long time. "They are threatening them," she said. "It appears so," Tix said. "They are threatening a species that has not yet been evaluated, a species under Sovereignty Protection Protocol." She felt something cold settle into her chest. This is a violation of everything. "The Vreth Dominion is not a sovereignty member," Tix said carefully. "They may not consider themselves bound by our protocols." "Everyone is bound by our protocols," Yaraseth said, and then stopped herself, because that was not actually true. The sovereignty was large, but the galaxy was larger. She sent another message to the relay point. This one was marked urgent, highest priority, which meant it would bounce through 6 relay stations and reach the High Council within hours rather than days. Then she watched the humans. They were panicking. That was expected. Their news feeds were full of the signal, the coordinates, the deadline. Leaders were making speeches. Scientists were talking in rapid, excited voices. Ordinary people were afraid. Some of them were very afraid. Some of them were angry. A smaller number, and Yaraseth found these ones the most interesting, were already asking what they could send. Not whether to send something. What? The debate inside the human governments was fierce and fast. 72 hours was not much time. They could not build anything new. They could only choose from what they had. And what they had, Yaraseth noted, was more than she had expected. The humans had been building military vessels for 20 years, ever since they had confirmed that the signals their early telescopes had caught were real, and that the universe was not empty. They had not announced this publicly, but their governments had quietly shifted resources. Yaraseth had it all in her observation files. She had flagged it twice as slightly unusual for a species their age, but had not considered it alarming. Now she pulled those files up and read them again, more carefully. The humans had 17 warships in active service. 7 were small, fast, lightly armed, used for patrol and response. 4 were medium class, with respectable weapons and solid shielding. 4 were heavy class, built for sustained combat. 2 were classified at a level that even Yaraseth's deep observation sensors had only caught in passing, during construction phases, and which had then disappeared into facilities she could not see into. She had marked those 2 as unknown class. She had noted their construction size as unusual, She had not followed up. She was following up now. The humans made their decision in 40 hours. A single transmission went out from Earth to the coordinates, brief and plain. It said, "We will send a ship." It did not say which ship. Yaroseth watched the humans' orbital stations and the dark side of their moon, where most of their fleet was stationed, and she waited. Tix stood beside her, also watching, also waiting. The rest of the crew was quiet. What came out of the shadow of the moon, 6 hours before the Vreth deadline, was not what anyone on the Quiet Eye had expected. It was one of the 2 unknown-class vessels. Yaroseth's sensors screamed. They were not designed to scream. They were military-grade observation instruments, the best the Sovereignty made. But the numbers they were returning were so far outside normal parameters that 3 separate alert systems triggered at once. The vessel was enormous. It was not as large as the Vreth ship. Nothing they had seen was as large as the Vreth ship. But it was the largest human-made object Yaroseth had ever recorded. Her sensors placed its length at roughly 4 kilometers. Its width was harder to calculate because it was covered in external structures, arrays, turrets, launch bays, sensor booms, that extended out from the hull in every direction, making the exact boundary of the ship difficult to determine. It was moving slowly, deliberately, at a pace that said, very clearly, that speed was not the point. The point was for the Vreth to see it. "Commander," Tix said, in a voice that had gone very quiet. "What is that?" "I don't know," Yaroseth said. "The humans call it something. Look up the construction files, whatever name they gave it during the build." Tix searched for a moment. The humans designated it Designation 6, unofficially, and I am reading this from their internal communications. "Commander, they call it the Titan." Yaroseth looked at the thing moving slowly out of the moon's shadow, weapon systems fully active, shields running at what her sensors estimated was combat-ready levels, and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Send a second priority message to the High Council. Tell them the situation has changed." The Vreth vessel, which had been sitting still and silent for 6 days, finally moved. It turned to face the Titan. And for the first time since it had arrived, it went quiet on all frequencies. The silence from the Vreth vessel lasted 9 minutes and 42 seconds. Commander Yaroseth counted every one of them. In space, silence from a ship that had been broadcasting constantly for 6 days was not nothing. It was something very specific. It meant that whoever was aboard that vessel was doing something they did not want anyone else to hear. They were talking among themselves, reassessing, recalculating. The Vreth ship had arrived with the confidence of something that had never had to second-guess itself, and the human Titan had put a crack in that confidence in the span of 6 minutes. Yaroseth made a note of this. She made a lot of notes. The Titan had stopped moving at a distance of roughly 2,000 kilometers from the Vreth vessel. At that range, Yaroseth's sensors could get a clear read on both ships. She spent those 9 minutes and 42 seconds doing exactly that, pulling every detail she could from the Titan's exterior. The ship was old by human standards, not old by galactic standards. Nothing the humans had built was old by galactic standards, but the construction signatures suggested it had been built over a long period of time, added to and modified repeatedly. It was not a clean design. It was a working design. There were patches on the hull where sections had been replaced. There were weapon emplacements that had clearly been upgraded from older models. There were launch bays that still bore the scorch marks of previous operations. This was not a ship built for ceremony. It was a ship that had been used, and kept, and improved, and used again. Tix was running his own analysis beside her. He pulled up a comparison model, the Vreth ship on one side, the Titan on the other, and overlaid their energy signatures. "Commander," he said, "the Titan's power output is, I am not certain our sensors are calibrated correctly." "They are," Yaroseth said, because she had already run the calibration check twice. "Then the humans have somehow built a power core with an output that exceeds anything the Sovereignty has fielded outside of a dedicated military installation." He paused. "In a ship, a mobile ship." "Write it down," she said. The silence broke. The Vreth vessel opened a channel, but not to Earth, to the Titan directly. Yaroseth's systems caught the transmission, and her translation suite went to work immediately. The Vreth language was complex, more complex than the message they had sent to Earth had suggested, and the full translation took almost a minute. But the core of it was clear from the first few seconds. The Vreth wanted to know what the Titan was. Not as a greeting, not as diplomacy. It was the question of something that had walked into a room expecting to be the biggest thing there, and was now staring at something it could not immediately classify. The phrasing carried an edge of something Yaroseth recognized from her long years of study. It was the edge of a predator that had suddenly become uncertain about whether it was the predator or the prey. The Titan's reply came within 30 seconds. It was in English first, then repeated in the Vreth's own language, which told Yaroseth that the humans had spent the last 6 days not just deciding what to send, but studying the Vreth signal and working on a translation of their own. In 40 hours, with no prior exposure to the language. She marked that in her log with 3 stars. The Titan's message was brief. It introduced itself as the UES Titan, a vessel of the United Earth Space Command. It noted that it had been sent in response to the Vreth's request for a representative. It said that humanity was pleased to meet the Vreth Dominion. And then, in a move that made Yaroseth close her eyes briefly and breathe very slowly, the Titan asked what the Vreth had meant by consequences. Not aggressively, not with a threat attached, just the question, plain and direct, in a tone that said, "We received your message, we noted that word, and we would like to understand what you meant by it before this conversation goes any further." Tix made a small sound. Yaroseth looked at him. That is a very precise thing to say," he managed. "Yes," she agreed, "it is." The Vreth vessel took 6 minutes to reply this time. When the response came, it had shifted slightly in tone. The translation was imperfect. Some concepts in Vreth did not map cleanly to any language in the sovereignty's database, which made working with a human translation even more uncertain. But the shift was clear, even through the noise. The Vreth had come expecting to speak to a frightened young species. They were now speaking to something else. The Vreth reply explained their position. The Vreth Dominion was an old power, not as old as the sovereignty, but old enough, with territory spanning 18 star systems, and a military that had not lost a conflict in 300 years. They had found humanity interesting because humanity was loud and warm and full of life, and the Vreth Dominion had a use for such species. The word they used translated roughly as resource, though Yaroseth's suite offered several alternatives, none of them more comfortable than the first. The Vreth said that they had come to begin the integration process. They said that Earth's system would become a productive member of the Dominion within 1 generation. They said this was not a negotiation. They said the consequences for refusal were the destruction of humanity's fleet and the removal of Earth's capacity to resist. Yaroseth pulled up the text of that last line and read it 4 times. Then she sent it to every station on the Quiet Eye, with a notation that they should all read it, so that later no one could say they had misunderstood what was being threatened. The Titan was silent for exactly 2 minutes after receiving the Vreth message. 2 minutes was a long time in a standoff between warships. A lot of things can happen in 2 minutes. Yaroseth's fingers moved over her console, ready to transmit to the High Council if something began to happen that the sovereignty needed to know about immediately. Nothing happened. The Titan just sat there, in the dark, in the silence, and waited out its 2 minutes. Then it replied. The reply was longer this time. It began by acknowledging the Vreth's history and strength, which was either genuine respect or the most controlled piece of diplomacy Yaroseth had ever heard from a species this young. It noted that 18 star systems was a significant territory. It expressed interest in learning more about the Vreth Dominion's culture and history. And then it said that humanity would not be joining the Vreth Dominion. Not because humanity was unwilling to engage with other civilizations. On the contrary, humanity looked forward to establishing relations with any species willing to engage in mutual respect. But because the terms as stated were not terms, they were a demand, and humanity did not respond well to demands. The Titan also said very clearly that if the Vreth Dominion chose to act on its stated consequences, humanity would respond. It did not say how. It did not describe what that response would look like. It simply said that there would be one. Then it waited again. Yaroseth realized she had been holding her breath. She let it out slowly. "They are not afraid," Tix said, in a voice of quiet wonder. "They are afraid," Yaroseth corrected. "They are very afraid. Look at the Titan's shield modulation. They have been at combat-ready status since they came around the moon. Their weapons systems are warm. They know exactly what is happening here." She paused. "They are just not showing it. And there is a difference." The Vreth vessel moved. It was a small movement, a shift in orientation, a turn of approximately 12 degrees. But in the context of a standoff between two armed ships, small movements had meaning. The Titan responded immediately, not by moving, but by adjusting its weapon arrays. The shift was visible on Yaroseth's sensor feeds. The Titan had more weapons than she had initially counted. Some of them had been dormant, tucked into the hull, and the Vreth's movement had woken them. More weapon arrays, more active. The Vreth ship stopped moving. Another silence, shorter this time, 4 minutes. The Vreth message that came after was different in character. The translation was harder to pin down, but the overall shape of it was familiar to Yaroseth from her years of diplomatic study. It was the message of a party that had expected a simple conversation and found something more complicated. It asked questions. How large was humanity's fleet? How many vessels like the Titan existed? What was the range of the Titan's weapons? Were there other ships behind it? The Titan answered none of these questions directly. Instead, it said that humanity was open to a more formal discussion, to be held at a neutral location, with a defined agenda and equal representation from both sides. It suggested that threats and consequences be set aside for the duration of such a discussion, and that both parties agree in advance that the discussion would not be binding. It was, Yaroseth thought, a perfectly constructed diplomatic opening, offering a path forward without conceding anything, proposing a framework without accepting any premise of the Vreth's original demand. Where did they learn to do that? Tix asked. 12,000 years of arguing with each other, Yaroseth said. Apparently it translated. The Vreth took an hour to reply. When they did, they agreed to the discussion framework. They named a date. They named conditions. And then, in a line that Yaroseth read twice, they asked whether the Titan would be attending the discussion, or whether humanity would send a different representative. She understood the question. The Vreth were asking whether the Titan was the human negotiator or the human threat. They wanted to know which role it was playing. The Titan's reply to that question was the shortest thing it had said in the entire exchange. It was 4 words in English, and the translation into Vreth was almost as brief. It said, "Both. We are both." Yaroseth sat back in her command chair and looked at the feed for a long moment. Then she pulled out her personal log and began to write. She wrote for a long time. She wrote about the Titan, about the humans, about the Vreth, and about all the things she had been wrong about in her 38 years of observing this small, noisy, confusing species on their small blue planet. She wrote, at the end, that she did not think the evaluation was going to go the way anyone at the High Council expected. Then she sent her full report to the relay station, marked it with her highest personal flag, and went back to watching. Because whatever happened next was going to be worth seeing. On Earth, the feeds were running the Titan's name on every channel. People were watching the sky. Some were crying. Some were cheering. Some were very quiet, sitting in their homes, looking at the dark through their windows, thinking thoughts that no observer's sensor could quite capture. In the shadow of the moon, the second unknown class vessel sat dark and silent and waiting. Yaroseth had almost missed it, earlier. She did not miss it now. She flagged it in her report with a note that she was beginning to think she had underestimated the humans in more ways than one, and that the High Council should perhaps read her previous 38 years of observation files with that in mind. The Galactic Sovereignty's High Council convened in emergency session 7 days after Commander Yaroseth's first report. That was fast. Emergency sessions typically took 12 days to organize, because the Council had members from 49 different species, spread across a volume of space so large that even fold space communication took time. 7 days meant someone at the top had read Yaroseth's report and understood what it meant. High Arbiter Solon Veth presided. She was Kethra, like most of the Sovereignty's senior leadership. and she had been an arbiter for longer than most of the junior council members had been alive. She was not easily surprised. She had read Yaroseth's report twice on the journey to the council chamber and had asked for a full data package, every sensor log, every translation, every frame of visual data the Quiet Eye had captured, to be transmitted ahead of her arrival. She opened the session with a question. Has anyone here ever observed a species at this stage of development respond to a Vreth contact scenario in this manner? The room was quiet. 49 species. Hundreds of combined years of diplomatic and military experience. Nobody spoke. I see, Solenveth said. Then we are in new territory. The Vreth Dominion was not unknown to the sovereignty. They had interacted twice before, at the edges of contested space, and both interactions had been tense but ultimately non-violent. The Vreth operated on a simple principle. They found species that were interesting, they offered integration into the Dominion, and if the species refused, the Vreth removed their ability to refuse again. It was not a pleasant system, but the sovereignty had not yet had grounds to directly oppose it, because the species the Vreth had targeted had all been unprotected, too young for the sovereignty's observation protocol, or in regions outside the sovereignty's formal territory. Humanity was different. Humanity was under observation, and that meant the sovereignty had a problem. The observation protocol was sacred. It existed to protect young species from exactly this kind of interference. But the protocol also assumed that the sovereignty would be the first to make contact, and that the contact would happen on the sovereignty's terms. None of that had happened. The Vreth had arrived uninvited. The humans had responded before the sovereignty could act, and now the two species were scheduled for a formal discussion that the sovereignty had not been part of and had no influence over. Council member Dresh Ka of the Molan raised a secondary limb. We should reveal ourselves. Make contact with the humans before this discussion takes place. Bring them under the full protection of the sovereignty protocol. Several other council members made sounds of agreement. And tell them what, exactly, said Council Member Yoritan of the Sef, that we have been watching them for 38 years without their knowledge, that we consider them interesting, but not yet ready to meet their neighbors. We reveal ourselves now, under these circumstances, and the first thing the humans will want to know is why we did not reveal ourselves before the Vreth arrived. More silence. There is a more immediate issue, Solenveth said, and her voice was calm in the way that very experienced leaders are calm when they are working very hard at it. The Titan. A display panel activated at the center of the chamber. The visual data from the Quiet Eye played, showing the Titan emerging from the moon's shadow, 4 kilometers of human engineering moving through space, with the slow deliberateness of something that had no reason to hurry. The council watched it. Nobody spoke for almost 2 minutes, which was the length of the relevant clip. Then Dreshka said, "How long have they had this?" Construction records suggest the Titan-class program began approximately 14 years ago, Yaroseth's voice said from the speaker, since she had been patched into the session from the Quiet Eye. We logged the early construction phases as unusual, but within the range of what a defensive-minded young species might develop. We did not flag it as a priority concern. You saw it being built, Yoritan said slowly, and did not flag it. With respect, Council Member, nothing in the observation protocols defines a size threshold for flagging military construction. We observed a species building ships. We noted the ships were larger than average. We did not know what the result would look like until we saw it. Another silence. Solenveth let it breathe for a moment, then continued. Commander Yaroseth has noted in her report that the Titan appears to have been built with significant modification cycles. It is not a new design. It has been developed, tested, revised, and developed again. The power output she recorded exceeds anything in our mobile military catalog. She let that land. She also reports that there is a second vessel of similar class, currently sitting dark in the moon's shadow. We have not been able to get a clear sensor read on it. A second one, Dreshka said. A second one, Solenveth confirmed. The council chamber was very quiet. They built 2 of them, said a council member from the back, Tav Sen of the Alluri, who had not spoken until now. They built 2 ships of a class that exceeds our mobile military capability, in secret, while being observed, and we did not notice until one of them came out from behind their moon to talk to the Vreth. Yes, Solenveth said. Tavsen made a gesture that in Alluri culture meant something between deep respect and mild fear. I want to revise my position on the evaluation. That is noted, Solenveth said dryly. Back in the human system, the Titan was on its way to the agreed meeting point, a location in neutral space, 3 light hours from Earth, that the humans and the Vreth had agreed on in a series of brief, careful transmissions over the previous 2 days. The Vreth vessel had arrived at the meeting point first. It was sitting there, waiting, when the Titan dropped out of fold space, 12 hours later. Yaroseth had followed at a careful distance, keeping the quiet eye invisible, with its full stealth suite running. She had also noticed, as the Titan left the human system, that it was not alone. 2 of the human heavy-class warships had taken up positions on either side of it, and a fast patrol vessel ran ahead as a scout. It was a small escort, but it was an escort. The humans were not sending the Titan alone. The Vreth vessel was not alone either. 2 support craft that had been sitting dark at the edge of the system had moved in to flank the main ship as the convoy approached. Yaroseth marked this. Both sides had brought backup. Both sides were being careful. That was, in a very specific way, a good sign. Careful parties did not usually start shooting. The meeting was conducted by radio transmission rather than in person, which was standard practice for first formal contact. The Titan's lead negotiator introduced herself as Admiral Hanna Petrova of the United Earth Space Command. She had a voice that was steady and direct, with an accent that the translation suite flagged as Eastern European. Yaroseth ran a search on the name. Admiral Petrova had been a naval officer for 29 years. She had commanded 4 vessels before the Titan. She had been involved in 3 military operations that the Sovereignty's observation files noted, but had not detailed, as they were Earth internal conflicts. She sounded, Yaroseth thought, exactly like someone who had spent 3 decades making hard decisions and was prepared to make more of them. The Vreth negotiator identified itself as a hierarchy speak, a title that translated roughly as chief spokesperson with authority to bind. Its voice, through translation, carried the kind of weight that came from a species accustomed to getting what it asked for. The discussion opened with the Vreth restating their position, somewhat more moderately than they had in their initial transmission. They spoke of partnership rather than integration. They spoke of benefits that membership in the Dominion would bring. They did not use the word consequences. Admiral Petrova listened to the full statement without interruption. Then she said, "We appreciate the revised framing. We would like to ask some clarifying questions." She asked about the nature of membership, what it required, what it restricted, what obligations it created. The Vreth answered, in terms that were somewhat vague. Petrova pressed for specifics. The Vreth gave some. Petrova pressed for more. The Vreth became slightly less comfortable, which came through even in translation. The key exchange happened in the 3rd hour of the discussion. Petrova asked directly whether Dominion membership required humanity to provide military service to the Dominion upon request. The Vreth said yes, within defined parameters. Petrova asked whether those parameters were set by Earth or by the Dominion. The Vreth said by the Dominion, as was standard for all members. Petrova was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So you are asking us to make our military available, to be directed by an external authority, the conditions of which we do not control, with consequences if we refuse. I want to make sure I understand the proposal correctly." The Vreth said that was a reductive description of a complex and mutually beneficial arrangement. Petrova said, "I'm a fairly direct person. I tend to describe things simply. Is my description factually incorrect?" The Vreth said it was not technically incorrect. Petrova said, "Then our answer is no. We will not agree to those terms. We would be very interested in discussing a different arrangement, an exchange of knowledge, trade protocols, open communication channels, mutual non-aggression. We think those things would benefit both our peoples. But we will not accept an arrangement that places our military under external command. That is not negotiable." Another silence. Longer this time. Yaroseth was writing as fast as her fingers could move. The Vreth hierarchy speak said, very carefully, that the Dominion's position had not changed. The offer stood. Refusal had consequences. Petrova said, equally carefully, that humanity's position also had not changed. They declined the offer, and she would like to clarify, for the record, exactly what humanity's response to consequences would look like. She did not describe the Titan. She did not mention ship classes or weapons ranges or power output. She simply said that humanity had prepared for this possibility, that they were prepared to defend themselves, and that they believed a conflict between the Vreth Dominion and humanity would be costly for both parties. She said that humanity did not want that. She said it with complete clarity, complete sincerity. She said that humanity had no desire to be anyone's enemy. Then she said that humanity was also not afraid. From the quiet eye, Yaroseth watched the two ships sitting in the dark of space, the vast Vreth vessel and the human Titan, 4 kilometers of scarred and modified and very, very prepared human engineering, and waited for what would come next. The Vreth did not reply for 11 hours. When they did not answer Petrova. They sent a transmission to the Vreth home system on a frequency they had apparently not realized the quiet eye could intercept. Yaroseth intercepted it anyway. The translation took most of the night. When it was done, she read it 3 times, then called Tix in and made him read it too. The Vreth were asking their home system for guidance. They were asking because the situation had developed in a way that their operational models had not predicted. They had expected a frightened species, a species that would ask how much the membership would cost, and whether they could negotiate the terms. They had not expected a species that already had a plan. They had not expected the Titan. The transmission said, in the Vreth's own words, that the human ship was unlike anything the Dominion had encountered in 300 years of expansion. They said the power readings were anomalous. They said the humans had spoken without fear and acted without hesitation, and they did not understand why. The last line of the transmission was the one Yaroseth underlined in her log. It said, "What are these creatures?" The Vreth home system's reply came back 43 hours later. Yaroseth had been running her intercept equipment at full sensitivity the entire time, watching the Vreth vessel and the Titan sitting across from each other in the dark, like 2 pieces on a board game that had run out of moves. The home system's answer was long. Parts of it were in a dialect of Vreth that her translation suite struggled with, older forms, the kind used in formal military and government communication. It took her team 3 full shifts to work through it completely. But the broad shape of the answer was clear within the first 2 hours, and she sent a preliminary summary to the High Council immediately. The Vreth home system was telling their ship to stand down, not to leave, not to give up, but to pause, to observe, to gather more information before taking any action. This was, by Yaroseth's reading of Vreth operational history, unprecedented. In 300 years of expansion, the Vreth had never once been told to pause. They escalated, or they withdrew. They did not wait. And yet here was the home system, telling their ship to wait, because they needed more data on this species before they could responsibly recommend a course of action. Humanity had made the Vreth Dominion hesitate. Yaroseth wrote that sentence in her log, and underlined it twice. The full translation, when it was complete, was even more interesting. The home system had asked their vessel a series of specific questions about the Titan, and about the human response overall. How had the humans translated the Vreth language so quickly? What was the Titan's actual armament? Could the sensors give more detail? Were there additional vessels of the same class? Had the humans shown any sign of fear, any sign of willingness to compromise, at any point in the exchange? The vessel's answers were detailed and, from Yaroseth's perspective, accurate. The humans had translated the language with remarkable speed. The Titan's armament was extensive and could not be fully catalogued from external sensors alone. There might be additional vessels. The shadow of the moon had not been fully cleared. The humans had been respectful and firm, and had not shown willingness to compromise on the core issue. The home system's response to that last point was the most telling. It said, "A species that does not show fear when it should be afraid is either very foolish or very confident. We must determine which before we act." Yaroseth forwarded that line to the High Council with a personal note. She wrote, "I believe they are beginning to understand what they are dealing with." On the Titan, Admiral Petrova was briefing her senior staff on the situation. Yaroseth could not hear the briefing. The Titan's internal communications were shielded, but she could observe the ship's external behavior, and the behavior told a story. The weapon arrays had not powered down. The shields were still at combat levels, but the ship had sent a small supply drone back toward Earth, which indicated that they were preparing to stay at the meeting point for an extended period. They had supplies to spare, and they were not worried about running out. Planning for a long conversation. That was either very patient or very stubborn. From what Yaroseth had observed of humanity, she suspected both. The Vreth vessel opened communication again on the morning of the third day. The hierarchy speaks tone had shifted. It was still formal, still carrying the weight of authority, but something in the rhythm of it was different. Less certain, it asked to resume the discussion. Admiral Petrova said yes immediately. This time the Vreth asked the questions. They wanted to know about Earth, not just its geography or population, which they had presumably observed from a distance, but about its history. They asked how long humanity had been a unified civilization. Petrova said humanity had not always been unified, that this was relatively recent, and still imperfect. The Vreth seemed surprised by that. They asked how a species that was not fully unified had managed to build something like the Titan. Petrova said, "We have a saying on Earth, necessity is the mother of invention. When we realized we were not alone in the universe, we also realized we could not afford to stay divided. Not if we wanted to be the kind of species that got to make its own choices." She said it simply, without drama. Yaroseth suspected that was the most honest answer the humans had given in the entire exchange, and it landed with a weight that even the translation could not fully strip away. The Vreth asked about the Titan specifically. How many people crewed it? What was its operational range? Had it been in combat? Petrova answered the first question. The Titan had a crew of approximately 4,000, and declined to answer the other two on the grounds that they were military intelligence. She said this pleasantly, without apology, in the same tone she might use to decline a second cup of coffee. The Vreth pressed. The operational range was a matter of safety planning for both parties. Surely she could share that. Petrova said, "I appreciate the reasoning." The answer is still no. The Vreth tried 3 more times with 3 different framings. Each time Petrova declined, pleasantly and without elaboration. By the third attempt, even the Vreth seemed to have recognized that this particular line of questioning was not going to produce results. Yaroseth made a note. Subject does not respond to repeated requests by eventually agreeing. Persistence is not a successful tactic. She also noted, with something that in a Kethra would have been called quiet admiration, subject knows exactly what information is safe to share. The crew number is not sensitive. Any sensor sweep could estimate it from life sign readings. The range and combat history are. The Admiral never confused the two. On the 4th day, something unexpected happened. The Vreth asked if they could see the Titan. Not in the visual sense. They could see it. They asked if they could send a small observation drone to conduct a closer inspection. They framed it as a gesture of mutual openness. They said that if humanity agreed, they would permit a human drone to inspect their vessel in return. Petrova asked for an hour to consider. During that hour, the Titan's crew, Yaroseth could see this in the infrared signatures through the hull, was having a fairly intense discussion. People were moving. There were a lot of people in what she assumed was the bridge section. When the hour was up, Petrova came back and said yes, with conditions. The drone would be a human drone, operated by humans. It would not enter the ship. It would not collect data beyond visual imaging. Any images taken would be shared with both sides simultaneously. The Vreth agreed to all conditions. The drone went out. It spent 6 hours circling the Vreth vessel, and the images it captured went out live on a shared channel that Yaroseth was recording in full. The Vreth ship was impressive, sleek in a way that the Titan was not, designed with aesthetics in mind alongside function, all clean curves and deliberate shapes. It was clearly very old, or built to a very old design. Parts of it looked like they had been added and removed, and added again over centuries. Yaroseth thought, watching the drone footage, that the Vreth vessel and the Titan had more in common than either side probably knew. Then the Vreth drone went out to inspect the Titan. The Vreth drone was more sophisticated than the human one. It moved faster, and its sensors were more capable. But the images it captured still went out on the shared channel, and Yaroseth recorded every frame. The Titan, seen up close, was extraordinary. From a distance, it was simply large, Up close, it was something else. The scale of it became real in a way that raw numbers could not quite communicate. The drone passed along the underside of the hull, and the view stretched in every direction, forward, back, to either side, like a city built into the void. Weapon emplacements the size of buildings. Sensor arrays as long as streets. Blast doors and access hatches and launch tubes, and observation ports and, in one long stretch of the secondary hull, windows. Actual windows, in a warship, lit from within. Someone on the Vreth vessel asked what the windows were for. A human technician on the Titan's communications crew, not the admiral, just a technician, answered. She said that the windows looked into the common areas, crew recreation spaces. The ship was in space for extended periods, sometimes years, and the crew needed to be able to see stars. The Vreth were quiet for a moment. Then the hierarchy speak said, with something that translated imperfectly but carried the unmistakable shape of genuine curiosity. You build rest spaces into your warships? The technician said yes. She said that happy crews perform better. She said that the Titan had a garden too, though it was a small one. Another silence. Yaroseth wrote in her log, the Vreth are beginning to realize that the humans are not just a military power, they are a civilization that happens to have a military. These are different things. The inspection ended. The drones came home. Both sides spent the rest of the day processing what they had seen. The Vreth sent their second transmission to the home system that night. Yaroseth intercepted it. This one was shorter. It said, the vessel is as large as reported. The crew is numerous and apparently comfortable. The humans have windows in their warship and a garden. We are not sure what to make of this. We await further instructions. The home system's reply came faster this time. It said, establish a communication archive. Record everything. Do not escalate. This species is unusual, and we need time to understand them. Yaroseth almost laughed. She had been writing the exact same thing in her observation logs for 38 years. On the 6th day, Admiral Petrova made an offer. She said that humanity was interested in establishing a formal relationship with the Vreth Dominion, if the Dominion was willing to approach that relationship differently. Not membership, not integration. A treaty. Mutual recognition, mutual non-aggression, open lines of communication, defined protocols for interaction. The kind of agreement that treated both parties as equals. She said that humanity believed the galaxy was large enough for both of them. She said that humanity was not looking for enemies, but that it also was not looking to be collected. She said that if the Vreth Dominion was willing to sit across from humanity as a peer, rather than looking down at it as a prospect, they might find that humanity was one of the more interesting neighbors they had ever had. The Vreth hierarchy speak was quiet for a long time after that. When it spoke, it said something that Yaroseth had to translate 3 times before she was certain she had it right, because it was not a phrase she had ever heard a Vreth representative use in the context of a diplomatic exchange. It said, we will consider your proposal. Not our position has not changed. Not, the Dominion will not accept this framing. Not, consequences remain in effect. We will consider your proposal. Yaroseth sent an immediate transmission to the High Council. She marked it as the highest priority she had ever used. She wrote one line. The Vreth are considering. The galactic sovereignty made its decision on the 9th day. High Arbiter Solon Veth called Commander Yaroseth directly, which was unusual. Arbiters typically communicated through official relay chains, through aides and secretaries, and formal logged channels. A direct call meant either something had gone very wrong, or a decision had been made that did not require a paper trail. Commander, Solon Veth said, we are going to make contact. Yaroseth had been expecting this. She had not expected it to come so soon. With the humans, High Arbiter? With everyone, Solon Veth said. We are going to contact the humans, and we are going to contact the Vreth, and we are going to do it at the same time, in the same message. No more watching from the shadows. The situation has moved faster than the protocols anticipated, and we are already behind. The Council approved this? Unanimously, which is something that has not happened in my lifetime. A brief pause. The Titan images helped. Yaroseth understood. She had seen the images herself. seen them on the sovereignty's internal networks where they had been circulating since she sent them. An alien ship, 4 kilometers long, emerging from behind a moon at exactly the right moment to face down an extragalactic threat. Nobody who had seen those images was uncertain about whether the humans were ready to be introduced to the larger galaxy. "What is our approach?" she asked. "We transmit simultaneously to both parties. We identify ourselves. We state that the human system has been under sovereignty observation for 38 years and falls under sovereignty protection protocols. We request that the Vreth Dominion stand down its vessel and withdraw from the human system, pending a formal 3-party discussion at a sovereignty-designated neutral site." "That will not please the Vreth," Yarazeth said. "No, but it will not surprise them either. They know our protocols. They have always known that the risk of pushing against a young species was that the species might be under observation." Solenveth's voice was measured, careful. "They took that risk. Now they deal with the result. And the humans? How do we explain 38 years of watching without announcing ourselves?" A pause. "Honestly," Solenveth said, "we tell them the truth. That we observe young species before making contact to protect them from exactly the kind of situation that just occurred. That we failed to protect them this time because events moved faster than anticipated. That we are sorry for that failure, and that we are rectifying it now." Yarazeth was quiet for a moment. "You think they will accept that explanation?" "I think they will be angry," Solenveth said, "but I also think they will listen. The humans appear to be very good at listening when they choose to be. The question is whether they choose to." Another pause. "Your reports suggest they will." "Yes," Yarazeth said. "I believe they will." The transmission went out 6 hours later, from every sovereignty relay station within range of the human system. It was sent in English, in Vreth, and in the 18 other major languages of the sovereignty's member species, because Solenveth had decided that if they were introducing themselves, they were going to do it properly. The transmission identified the galactic sovereignty, gave a brief description of its nature and membership, explained the observation protocol, acknowledged that protocol had not worked as intended in this instance, and formally requested a 3-party discussion. It also said, in very clear terms, that the sovereignty considered the human system under its protection, and that any action taken against humanity by any party would be considered an action against the sovereignty. That line was not subtle. It was not meant to be. The Vreth vessel received the message and went silent for 14 hours, the longest silence yet. Yarazeth used the time to get the Quiet Eye into a better position, closer to the meeting point, in case the Vreth decided to respond with something other than words. The humans received the message and responded in 2 hours. Admiral Petrova's voice was controlled, professional, exactly what Yarazeth had expected. She said that humanity was receiving the sovereignty's message, that humanity would need time to consult with Earth's governments before making any formal response, and that in the meantime, humanity noted the sovereignty's stated protection and was glad to hear it. She also said, and this was the line that Yarazeth noted in her log with a small, involuntary sound of amusement, that humanity had several questions about the observation program and looked forward to asking them when an appropriate forum could be arranged. Not angry, not frightened, looking forward to asking questions. Tix looked at his commander. "They are not angry?" "Oh, they are angry," Yarazeth said. "They are being polite about it. There is a difference, and they will ask those questions. Every one of them. And they will expect real answers." She paused. "Make sure the High Council is prepared for that." The Vreth response came on the morning of the 2nd day after the sovereignty's message. It was addressed to the sovereignty, not to the humans, which was itself meaningful. The Vreth were not acknowledging humanity as a party in this exchange. They were talking to the power they recognized. The Vreth said that the Dominion had not been aware the human system was under sovereignty observation. They said this was a regrettable misunderstanding. They said that the Dominion had no interest in conflict with the sovereignty and was prepared to withdraw its vessel pending clarification of boundaries and protocols. They said they would attend a 3-party discussion. Yarazeth read the message twice. Then she sent a short note to Solenveth that said, "They are backing down. Recommend we accept their face-saving language and move forward." Solenveth replied, "Agreed. Well done, Commander." Yarazeth sent a 3rd message, this one to her own personal log. It said, "They are not backing down because of the sovereignty's message. They backed down because of the Titan. The sovereignty's message gave them a reason to retreat that did not look like a retreat. That is an important distinction, and I want to record it clearly." She thought about that for a moment, and then added, "Humanity did something the sovereignty has not done in a very long time. They changed the calculation, not through politics, not through alliances, not through any framework the sovereignty built. They did it with a ship and a very calm admiral, and the knowledge of exactly how much to say and how much to leave unsaid." She paused and added one more line. "I am looking forward to meeting them properly." The three-party discussion was scheduled for 30 days out, to allow travel time and preparation. The location chosen was a sovereignty station called the Sungate, positioned at a point in space equidistant from the sovereignty's center, the Vreth's nearest occupied system, and the human home system. It was a place that had hosted more than 100 such discussions over its long history, and it was good at them. In the days leading up to the meeting, several things happened. The human government released the full story to its public, all of it, the Vreth contact, the Titan's deployment, the sovereignty's existence, the 38 years of observation, all of it. There was no attempt to manage the release or soften the information. It went out complete and unedited, with a full record of every transmission, every exchange, every moment of the standoff. The world reacted with exactly the range of emotions that such information would produce. There was fear and anger and wonder and grief and enormous relief, and a lot of very heated arguments about what came next and who got to decide it. But underneath all of that, something else ran through the human response, something Yaroseth watched in the feeds with growing certainty that she was seeing something important. Pride. Not arrogance, not the pride that came from thinking yourself better than others, the quiet, solid pride of a species that had been tested by something real and had not broken, that had sent one of its best out into the dark with the authority to speak for all of them, and that ship had spoken well. The Titan came home to a world that was different than it had left, stranger, larger, more complicated, and the world was glad it had gone. Admiral Petrova gave a brief statement from the Titan's bridge on the day they began the return journey. She was not a person who gave long speeches, and she did not give one now. She said that the crew of the Titan was grateful for the confidence humanity had placed in them. She said that they had not come home with an alliance or a treaty, but that they had come home with an open door, which was more than they had when they left. She said that the universe was larger than anyone had known, and that this was not, in her opinion, a bad thing. Then she said that the Titan would need extensive maintenance before its next deployment, and that she planned to sleep for about a week. The response to that last line was warm across every channel that carried the broadcast. The sovereignty sent a formal delegation to the Sungate ahead of the meeting. High Arbiter Solon Veth would attend in person, another first, another measure of how seriously the sovereignty was taking this. She brought with her a delegation of 40, including specialists in first contact, language, history, and what the sovereignty called adaptation ecology, which was the study of how a species changed in response to learning it was not alone. Yaroseth was included in the delegation. She brought Tix and 3 of her senior analysts. She also brought her 38 years of observation files, all of them, organized and indexed and cross-referenced, because she intended to give the humans the most complete record of themselves that any outside observer had ever compiled, and she intended to give it without conditions or concessions. It was theirs. It had always been theirs. She had just been holding it. The Vreth delegation arrived at the Sungate 2 days before the scheduled meeting. They were smaller than expected, only 12 individuals, headed not by a hierarchy speak, but by someone who translated as a senior assessor, which was a rank several steps above the hierarchy speak. The Vreth had sent someone more senior than the ship's negotiator. That meant they were taking this seriously. The human delegation arrived on the day of the meeting, aboard a vessel that Yaroseth did not recognize from her observation files. It was a new ship, newer than the Titan, smaller, clearly built for diplomacy rather than combat. It had large windows. It had the word Earth written on its hull, in letters that were visible from a significant distance, which was either a statement of identity or a statement of intention, and possibly both. The delegation that came off the ship was led by a woman named Dr. Asha Mehta. who was introduced as the Secretary General of the Earth Alliance for Interstellar Affairs, a position, Yaroseth noted, that had not existed 2 months ago. The humans had created an entire government body for this purpose, in the time between the standoff and the meeting. She was small and calm, and had the look of someone who had spent the entire journey preparing, and was still not done preparing. She shook Solenveth's hand, a human greeting gesture that the Kethra adapted to with impressive speed, and said that humanity was glad to finally have a proper introduction. She said it without a trace of bitterness, and Yaroseth, watching from 3 meters away, decided that the humans were either very good at diplomacy or very good at waiting for the right moment to ask their questions, possibly both. The first session lasted 6 hours. It covered the sovereignty's history and structure, the observation protocol and its purpose, and the formal status of humanity as a protected species in transition. The humans asked questions throughout. Good questions, specific questions, the kind that came from people who had read everything they could find and wanted the gaps filled in. Solenveth answered all of them, including the ones about the 38 years of observation, and she answered them honestly, and humanity's delegation listened to those answers, and recorded them, and asked follow-up questions. They were, as Yaroseth had predicted, angry about the observation. They were polite about the anger. They noted that they understood the reasoning, that they might have done the same in the sovereignty's position, and that they intended to have a much longer conversation about consent and transparency before any future protocols were agreed to. Solenveth said that was entirely reasonable. The Vreth session came on the second day. It was shorter. The senior assessor sat across from Dr. Mehta and Solenveth and presented a formal statement on behalf of the Dominion. The statement acknowledged that the Dominion's initial approach to humanity had been inappropriate. It used a Vreth term that translated as unsuited to the context, which was not quite an apology but was as close to one as Vreth diplomatic language apparently had. Dr. Mehta accepted this with grace. She said that humanity bore no ill will toward the Vreth Dominion. She said that she hoped they could establish a relationship built on different terms going forward. The senior assessor asked, in a way that came out almost curious rather than formal, how humanity had known to send a ship like the Titan. Dr. Mehta thought about the question for a moment. Then she said, "We didn't know anything about you specifically, but we knew that the universe was large and we were small in it, and that first impressions matter. We thought it was better to seem capable than to seem weak. We hoped we would never have to prove whether we actually were." A pause. Then, with something that might have been amusement underneath the formality, "As it turned out, we did not." The senior assessor considered that for a long moment. Then it said something that took the translators a minute to render, and when they did, the chamber was very quiet. It said, "We have met many species. We have not met one like you. We think we would like to learn more, if you are willing to be learned about." Dr. Mehta said that humanity was an open book, as long as the Vreth were willing to sit down and read it properly, rather than just take it. And the senior assessor, in a response that would be quoted in diplomatic records across 12 species for the next 100 years, said, "We believe we can agree to that." Commander Yaroseth sat in the observation gallery above the chamber and watched all of it. She watched the humans and the Vreth and the sovereignty's own delegation navigate the first hours of a relationship that would take decades to fully form. She watched Dr. Mehta ask sharp questions and listen carefully to the answers. She watched Solenveth handle the session with the skill of someone who had done this 100 times and knew exactly when to push and when to give way. She watched the senior assessor, a creature whose species had spent 3 centuries treating the universe as a resource to be collected, sit across from a human woman and be, very carefully, uncertain. And she wrote in her log, for the last time on this assignment, something that she had been building toward for 38 years of careful observation. She wrote, "I have spent almost 4 decades watching this species, and I have been surprised by them more times than I can count. I was surprised by how fast they cooperated when threatened. I was surprised by what they built in secret. I was surprised by how they spoke to the Vreth, not with bravado, not with fear, but with the steady confidence of people who had decided what they were, and were not going to be moved from it. I was surprised, most of all, by the windows, by the garden, by the fact that when they built a ship designed for war, they put in windows, so the crew could see the stars. She paused and looked down at the chamber, at the humans sitting at the table below, these creatures who had written songs about their sadness and then danced to them, who had argued with each other for millennia and then cooperated in 48 hours when something from outside arrived at their door. She finished her log entry. I spent 38 years wondering if they were ready for the galaxy. I think I had the question backwards. I think the real question is whether the galaxy was ready for them. And looking at this room, at the Vreth sitting down to talk instead of fight, at the sovereignty revealing itself and calling it overdue, I think the answer is that the galaxy is going to have to get ready, whether it planned to or not. She closed her log. Down in the chamber, Dr. Mehta was asking for more tea and simultaneously explaining to a bewildered Vreth senior assessor what tea was. The galaxy was not ready, but it was learning.